Now, if your only source of news is the mainstream media, then you probably won't know about this. But over the last few days, there's been even more protests happening around the country. I mean, today there's been one in Mansfield. There's been repeated protests outside the Britannia Hotel in Canary Wharf. There's a bunch more happening. There's one in Waterlooville. They're happening everywhere, really. And the mainstream media just isn't talking about this. And they're not talking about this because they know that if they do, that it will only encourage more people to join in on the protests, right? The only way you'll know about the protests is if you're very active on X, like I am. But the general public probably won't know about these protests because they're just not covered in the legacy media. You know, most people still get their news from TV or newspapers or through like establishment-based supportive YouTube channels and so on, like channels like TLDR News and stuff. And it's just not being covered about the fact that across England protests are happening about illegal immigration ever since the Epping protests. You know, that Epping really inspired the rest of the country to start protesting. Yeah, and the protests aren't being covered by the legacy media because they know that if they do start covering them, then more people will join in. The only way they will cover the protests is if it gets so big that it will just look absolutely stupid if they don't cover it. And even then, it will probably only be like a little sub-article buried deep in the website or something like that. Or they will cover it if the protests turn violent. Because what the media want to do is to create this narrative of anti-immigration people being football hooligans, being thugs and so on. And there certainly are a lot of people that are anti-immigration that fit into that category. But if you look at these protests that have been happening, you know, there's a lot of women there, there's a lot of young people, a lot of old people, you know, all sorts of people, all sorts of English people are coming out and protesting because, you know, mass immigration, in terms of the crime that it's having, you know, that's what these protests are about. They're about the repeated rapes and sexual assaults that are happening. It's not the men that it's affecting, it's the women. Although, yes, there are some cases of men being raped by these illegal immigrants. It's predominantly women that are being affected. And that's why, you know, a lot of the people at these protests are women. But if these protests turn violent, then it will give the media an excuse to label all of the people there as football thugs and so on. And that will probably dissuade a lot of the women from going. And, you know, we don't want that to happen. So if you are going to a protest, don't act like an idiot. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, and it is good to see all of these protests happening because, you know, for 70 years now we've had mass immigration, and, you know, the only real protests we've had were the ones last year. You know, they were very serious. You know, we haven't really had anything like what happened last year after Southport, and, you know, we won't get up to that same amount of anger this year, but we could get somewhere close. And I suppose the difference is with these protests is that the Southport ones were triggered by an event, right? The Southport killings, and they were inspired by, if we're being honest, the misinformation that was spread online. But it's not true that the protests were the result of misinformation, because the police corrected the fact that he wasn't an illegal immigrant. He was actually the son of legal immigrants from Rwanda before most of the protests actually happened. So if someone says that the protests only happened because of misinformation, then they're lying and they're the real misinformation. But the misinformation did help to get the protests going and give them more fuel than otherwise would have happened. But there still would have been some protests had it not been for the misinformation. Well, the difference with these protests is that there's no real starting point. There's no single event that's caused it to happen. I mean, the Epping things did inspire it, and that was because of one sexual assault by one immigrant. And there's been repeated protests in Epping, even though they're now saying that they're moving them out of the hotel, and protests are happening all over the country, not because of that one sexual assault, but because of all of the sexual assaults that are happening by these illegal immigrants, because people are fed up with it, wherever these immigrants are from, and whichever hotel they're staying in, whichever the community they're being dumped on. And the other difference, I think, between these protests and last year's protests is that they're a lot more organic, right? Like, last year's protests, the main reason they happened was because Tommy Robinson was promoting it very heavily on X, telling people to go out and protest and stuff. Whereas with this one, it's people that are local in the community that are organising it. And I think it's much better to have organic local protests rather than national protests, because the problem with these national protests is that they get associated with the person or the group that's setting them up. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but with the case of Tommy Robinson, that is a bad thing, because he's a civic nationalist, grifter, so on, stuff that I don't need to go into now. But if it happens organically, then there's no one person that you can blame it on. It's like, with the Epping protests, they've made an attempt at blaming the Homeland Party for organising it. And yes, one of the people from the Homeland Party, as far as I'm aware, did play a big role in organising it, but it wasn't organised by Homeland, not in the same way that Tommy Robinson organised the protest last year. And, the Homeland Party only really got involved in the Epping protests. So you can't credit or blame, whatever word you want to use, Homeland for all of the protests that are happening. So yeah, that is a difference. And yeah, hopefully we can see more of these protests. It shows that the Saxon really is beginning to hate, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. People are full of hate if they love something more, and if you love your country and you love your people, then you should hate what is a threat to it. That doesn't mean that you have to go around abusing ethnic minorities, but the idea of mass immigration is something that is worth hating, I think. It's going to result in you becoming a minority in your own country. Why should that have to happen to you? What did you do to deserve it? If the answer is the Empire, then that's just such a stupid reason. The British Empire wasn't all good, but was mostly good for the world. Africa hasn't really developed since the British Empire left. But yeah, and the other protest that's happened over the last few days that's worth talking about is one organised by Britain First in Manchester. Their so-called March for Remigration. And look, I don't have a problem with groups like Britain First during protests. It is to generate publicity for their organisation and to spread awareness for the cause of remigration. But I do have a problem with Britain First. I'm on their email list, and they were sending emails out saying that they need £20,000 to organise this protest, and it's like, I don't know how much protests cost to organise, but do you really need £20,000? Or it's like Tommy Robinson for his September 13th free speech rally. He wants £100,000 for that. Do you really need 100,000? Probably not. Tommy Robinson today was arrested, and he's already sent out an email asking for more money. And so it's just a bit silly, really. A lot of people are in nationalist and patriotic politics for themselves rather than for the cause, and unfortunately I think Paul Golding and Tommy Robinson do fit into that category quite comfortably. We need leaders that are in the movement for their own people, not for money. And unfortunately, hasn't really been a clear leader that's emerged. Look, I like people like Steve Laws and stuff, but he just doesn't have the same impact that Tommy Robinson has. So yeah, hopefully Tommy Robinson will fade into irrelevance, and hopefully we'll see more and more of these protests happening, not because of outside influence, although outside influence is better than nothing, but ideally more protests will happen locally and organically, which does seem like what is happening. So yeah, just if there's a protest near you, attend it. You know, we need as many people as possible to attend these protests. The next election is in 2029. You know, electoral politics is still 4 years away. Meta politics is what we need to work on for the time being, and so we need to normalise the idea of remigration and deportations. And if we get lots of people go to these protests, then that's all we can ask for at the moment, really. But yeah, if you've enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching. Bye.